Hello, I'm John Froberg, and I'm a candidate for an Educational Specialist degree in Instructional Technology at Kennesaw State University. Today I'll be discussing my research project, which is a study of the relationship between student satisfaction and achievement of ESL students in traditional and blended math and social studies classrooms. Before we can begin talking about those questions, we need to define those terms. An ESL student is described as a student who is receiving services for the acquisition of the English language, and the blended learning classroom is described as a classroom in which students learn at least part-time through online content, where the student also has some degree of control over time, place, path, or pace. With those vocabulary terms defined, some important questions that we're looking to study during this research were: are blended classrooms effective for ESL students? Can student satisfaction lead to higher levels of achievement? And finally, is there any correlation between a student's satisfaction with their educational environment and their scores on access tests and their student grades? The literature on this was very interesting. It showed that there has been rapid, steady growth in online curricula. As a matter of fact, Clark in 2000 found that in secondary instructional models, online and blended learning have become prolific for both native and ESL populations. And there's little research on how well these newer methods work compared to traditional teaching. In a 2011 study, Raw found that while there's a plethora of information on the use of newer instructional models, there's little current research on the efficacy of those models when compared to traditional models. And then traditional classrooms have historically been unsuccessful in educating ESL students. That's been studied many times, including studies by Gunderson and Morakowski and Smith, which showed that students at the secondary level qualifying for ESL services often struggled with language so much that it negatively affected their ability to acquire new information in core content areas such as math, science, English, and social studies. While there's been very little research done on satisfaction and achievement, a 2011 study by Edgerton, McKechnie, and McEwen did examine the relationship between students' perception of their school's physical environment and their educational outcome. And the research suggested that more positive perceptions of the physical school environment are associated with higher academic and global self-esteem, greater engagement with school, more mastery approach to learning, and fewer negative behaviors. Methodology: all of the participants came from either the traditional high school or the blended learning academy, and all students were being served by the ESL department and were at Tier B or above. The reason for that Tier B designation is to be accepted into the Blended Learning Academy, you have to be at a Tier B in ESL so that you'll be able to be successful in the online curriculum. So to be sure that the two samples were similar, I set the Tier B for both the traditional and the Blended Academy. And the data was collected from student surveys and a review of school records. The surveys were used for the student satisfaction. If you notice, the survey has 5 questions on it. Each of them has 3 choices. Not at all satisfied would be 0 points, somewhat satisfied would be 1 point, and completely satisfied would be 2 points, which means you could get anywhere from 0 to 10 points. Analysis of the data was done using descriptive statistics due to the small sample sizes. For inferential statistics, you generally need to have a population of at least 25, a sample of at least 25 from your population. In this case, for one group, the sample size was 12, for the other it was only 5. So we were using descriptive statistics, which meant we were using summaries of the quantitative data. Generally, that's mean, median, mode, and a trend line involved with that. And then for this particular data analysis, there were scatter plots made of the data that were created and analyzed. When we look at the results, there was no statistic between student satisfaction and academic proficiency. If we look at the graph of that, you see that for the traditional school, there is a positive correlation between student satisfaction and academic average, but the correlation between that is only 63%, which isn't really high enough to be significant. This is the closest to significant result that we got from any of the survey data. And for the blended learning academy, there's actually a negative trend showing that as students are more satisfied, their academic average is actually lower. Part of that is obviously going to be the fact that there's only 5 people in that sample. When looking at the correlation between student satisfaction and the access scores, there was also not a statistically significant correlation found there. And if you look at that graph, you'll see that the correlation coefficient for traditional is less than 10%, and for blended is still under 34. To be statistically significant, you need to be at least a 0.8, which would show that there's about an 80% correlation between those two things. Here, the access scores don't range that much, which made it very difficult to do this comparison. So the student satisfaction scores ranged, from a 5 to a 10. However, the access scores really only ranged from about a 3.6 to about a 5.4. So because of that very narrow range of access score, it's very hard to show any kind of correlation because you don't have a lot of range. Then finally, the data was actually tabulated, and those results were examined. Then, in addition to those correlational studies, the data was also put into a table, and the results were analyzed there. And if we look at that table, there are some interesting things to see there. The academic average and the student satisfaction score are slightly higher for the traditional school than they are for the blended academy, despite the fact that if you look at the access scores, there's only one student whose access score in the blended academy is lower than any of the access scores in the traditional school. Also, when we look at this, if you look at the math grades, in the traditional school it's a 67 average, while in the blended academy it's only 53, and there's only one student in the blended academy who's actually passing a math class, which would seem to indicate that perhaps the blended academy is not the best place for ESL students to be taking their math courses. This definitely needs to be studied further to see if this is generalizable beyond just this small sample. So in reflection, the research did open communication with principals. It gave me a chance to talk to the principal at the traditional school as well as at the blended academy so that we could be starting discussions about the effects of environment on student success. And obviously this does show that there is more research needed. Perhaps it would be interesting to look at student satisfaction for all students versus their success, and to look at access score and achievement in a totally online environment or in a blended environment to see if either of those is more successful. While this research didn't provide definitive answers, I do hope that the questions raised will stimulate discussion and further research. Thank you for taking the time to view this presentation.